The sun bathed the quiet neighborhood of Cedar Ridge in a soft golden hue, casting long shadows over the rows of modest yet well-kept homes. At the far end of the cul-de-sac stood an older brick house, slightly elevated and covered with lush ivy. It was owned by Miles Wren, a quiet, environmentally conscious engineer who had traded corporate chaos for solar panels, compost bins, and tomato vines. His pride and joy? A sleek, self-sustaining rooftop greenhouse he had built over 2 years. It looked like something from a sci-fi garden magazine: glass panes, climbing greenery, and a soft hum of hydroponic systems running underneath. Miles lived simply and sustainably. While others were glued to reality shows, he spent evenings pruning basil or recalibrating his solar converters. The neighborhood appreciated his quiet nature, even if they didn't quite understand his futuristic greenhouse thing. It wasn't until the blackout 2 winters ago, when half the street mysteriously retained power thanks to Miles' overcapacity energy storage, that people began to realize just how much his rooftop lab was quietly contributing. Then Karen moved in. She wasn't technically named Karen. Her name was Judith Templeton, president of the newly formed Cedar Ridge Homeowners Quality Assurance Board, which she proudly abbreviated as CRHQAB. She had arrived with a clipboard, a gold nameplate, and the fierce determination of a woman who once got a mall fountain removed because it wasn't symmetrical. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, wind chimes had been outlawed, all lawn ornaments deemed tacky, and trash bins had to be brought in within 22 minutes of collection, exactly. Miles, of course, had kept to himself. He didn't mind rules as long as they didn't interfere with his plants or peace. But peace has a short shelf life when Karen thinks she's found a code violation. It happened on a Wednesday. Miles was on the roof adjusting a UV panel when he heard the unmistakable squeak of orthopedic sandals and a voice that sliced through the hum of the greenhouse fans. "Excuse me, sir, that structure is in violation of neighborhood aesthetics." He turned to find Karen on the sidewalk, arms crossed, lips pursed, eyes glaring up at his greenhouse like it had personally insulted her petunias. Miles blinked, confused. "It's a greenhouse, been here for years." "Exactly," she snapped. "And I've just reviewed the Cedar Ridge neighborhood design guidelines. Your rooftop jungle was never approved. It's an eyesore and it must come down." He stared at a loss. "You want me to dismantle the greenhouse?" "Effective immediately," she said, flipping a page on her clipboard, "or face official fines." And just like that, the battle began. Miles stood on his roof long after Karen had marched off, her clipboard tucked like a sword under her arm. The audacity of it all left a bitter taste in his mouth. That greenhouse wasn't just a hobby. It was a culmination of years of research, labor, and innovation. He'd reinforced the roof beams himself, secured all the proper permits before the HOA even existed, and the structure had passed multiple city inspections. But now, suddenly, because one woman with a taste for power and a hatred for glass panes decided it clashed with her stucco aesthetic, it was illegal. Down in his workshop that evening, Miles sat at his cluttered workbench surrounded by tools and old circuit boards. He stared at the citation she'd slipped under his door, her handwriting needlessly large and aggressively underlined. "Violation of HOA Code 3.7, unauthorized rooftop modifications." But Miles knew that code didn't exist until last week. She had literally created a rule just to go after him. The next morning, he tried reasoning. He approached Karen while she was pruning imaginary dead leaves from her plastic lavender bushes. "Karen, with respect, this greenhouse is completely safe. It actually provides backup power to multiple houses. During the last outage, the Smiths and the Nuyens." She didn't even look up. "Irrelevant. The board has deemed it an eyesore and potentially hazardous. This is a residential neighborhood, not a botanical spaceport." "There isn't even a real board," he replied, trying to stay calm. "It's just you and 2 other people who thought your potluck flyer looked nice." Karen spun around, brandishing her clipboard like a badge of honor. "The CRHQAB is a provisional committee pending full neighborhood ratification, which, by the way, is scheduled for next month. In the meantime, I'm authorized to enforce interim code compliance." "You made that up." "It's in the charter." "What charter?" "The one I wrote," she said smugly. It would have been funny if it wasn't so absurd. But the real kicker came later that day when Miles noticed something missing from his roof. He climbed up to find one of the outer UV panels gone, unbolted and carefully removed. His security camera footage confirmed it. Karen, in broad daylight, with a ladder and a smug grin, stealing property that shouldn't have been there anyway. He filed a police report, but they said it was a civil matter, since the HOA technically claimed jurisdiction over structural disputes. Miles felt like he'd stepped into a surreal bureaucratic nightmare with no exit. He wasn't just angry now, he was rattled. That evening, the greenhouse lights flickered for the first time in years. The power load was off because of the missing panel, and as if choreographed by fate, a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Nguyen. "Miles, our power's been out for an hour. Your system's usually what keeps us going. Is everything okay?" He looked up at her, then back toward Karen's house. Something inside him shifted. No, this wasn't just about his greenhouse anymore. It was war. The days that followed felt like a passive-aggressive circus. Karen doubled down on her crusade against the greenhouse with the zeal of someone who had finally found her life's purpose. She began handing out leaflets to neighbors titled "The Dangers of Unauthorized Rooftop Structures," filled with dramatic clip art and bullet points that included fictional hazards like potential squirrel infestations and glare-related eye strain. Miles watched it unfold with disbelief. It wasn't just about rules anymore, it was personal. She had made him the villain in a campaign to assert dominance over the neighborhood, and her propaganda was starting to stick. Some neighbors who had once smiled and waved now avoided eye contact. The few who still supported Miles, like the Nguyens and old Mr. Dalton, whispered their support quietly, afraid to cross the self-declared queen of Cedar Ridge. Then came the letter. Certified mail, HOA letterhead, all in Comic Sans for some reason. It demanded the immediate dismantling of the greenhouse or Miles would face escalating daily fines, potential legal proceedings, and possible loss of community privileges. Whatever that meant. Karen had invented an entire category of punishments out of thin air. And it didn't stop there. One morning, Miles stepped outside to find a city inspector on his lawn, clipboard in hand and looking confused. "Hi, Mr. Wren. We got an anonymous report that your greenhouse was leaking hazardous waste into the neighborhood drainage system." Miles nearly laughed. "Hazardous waste? It's a hydroponic system. The runoff is basically spinach-flavored water." Still, the inspector had to do his job. He checked the water lines, tested the runoff, even sampled the soil nearby. Everything came back cleaner than tap water. The inspector, clearly annoyed, muttered, "This is the third fake report I've had on your property this month. Whoever's doing this needs a hobby." Miles just pointed across the street, where Karen was peeking from behind her curtain, eyes narrowed like a hawk who'd spotted a rat with a clipboard. She wasn't done. The next week she filed a noise complaint. About what? Suspicious humming noises during early hours, which turned out to be the greenhouse's oxygen circulation system. Miles ended up in a hearing with the so-called temporary HOA panel, which met in Karen's living room and featured a cheese plate and a framed photo of her with a city councilman from 2009. It was all getting absurd, but through the irritation, Miles noticed something important. Karen had no real power. Her threats were made of smoke and sarcasm, backed by nothing more than a stolen clipboard and the occasional uppercase memo. Her obsession had become a game of appearances and control, not logic. That night, Miles stood beneath the glowing dome of his greenhouse, its silhouette shimmering against the stars. His hands were clenched, his thoughts racing. She wanted a war of rules and technicalities. Fine, he'd play, but on his terms. And when he was done, she'd wish she'd never touched that UV panel. Miles spent the next week not in frustration, but in silence. He stopped replying to Karen's notes, ignored her veiled threats, and let her flail with her fake citations like a traffic cop in a ghost town. Outwardly, it looked like he had given up. But in truth, he was gathering everything he needed: blueprints, records, permits, energy usage logs, even emails from city engineers who had previously praised his setup for its innovative off-grid capabilities. What Karen didn't know and had never bothered to check was that Miles, Rooftop greenhouse had been part of a pilot project with the city's renewable energy division, a grant-funded initiative that allowed select homeowners to test urban sustainability solutions. It wasn't just legal, it was celebrated. Miles had even done a small TEDx talk about it years ago, though he never brought it up. But now he printed out every shred of proof he had and stacked them in a neat manila folder labeled, just in case. Meanwhile, he ran diagnostics on the greenhouse, documenting how the power it generated was routed into a communal storage battery he had installed underground. That battery powered 5 homes that Karen hadn't even realized were hooked up to his system through a clever, voluntary energy-sharing loop the neighbors had agreed to. Miles had paperwork for every signature. He even had footage of the time Karen herself flicked on her Christmas lights during a brownout, fully powered by the greenhouse she hated so much. One evening, he sat with Mrs. Nguyen and Mr. Dalton, sipping herbal tea in the glow of LED lanterns. "She thinks this is about aesthetics," Miles said, shaking his head. "But it's about control. The moment I pull down that greenhouse, she gets to say she won, that she can tear down what works just because it doesn't fit her idea of pretty." Mrs. Nguyen nodded. "She thinks the clipboard makes her the mayor." Mr. Dalton chuckled. "Let her think it. You've got the real power, literally." And that's when the real idea sparked in Miles' mind. It wasn't enough to prove Karen wrong. He needed to show everyone just how right he'd been all along, and do it in a way so undeniable, so public, and so poetic that even Karen couldn't squirm her way out. He spent the next few nights tinkering with his system, adjusting the voltage monitoring triggers, coding a few harmless but dramatic fail-safes, and setting up a diagnostic dashboard that could be broadcast on a local network. Meanwhile, he reached out to the city's sustainability office and invited them for a walkthrough of his setup, casually mentioning that someone had been trying to get it shut down. "Oh, that's not happening," the program director replied immediately. "We still use your data in presentations. That greenhouse is a model project." "Perfect." By the time the inspection date rolled around, Miles had everything lined up. He didn't just want to win. He wanted Karen to be there, clipboard in hand, watching it all unfold. And when it did, she wouldn't know whether to scream or applaud. Saturday morning arrived crisp and bright, the kind of day that made Cedar Ridge look like the backdrop of a real estate brochure. Miles moved with a calm precision, brewing his coffee, trimming a few tomato plants, and casually placing a green energy open house sign in his yard. It was subtle enough not to raise eyebrows, yet intriguing enough to make the neighborhood curious. Karen, of course, couldn't resist. Within 15 minutes, she was on her porch with binoculars, trying to decipher the meaning behind the sign. When she finally marched over, clipboard at the ready, Miles greeted her with a smile so polite it bordered on suspicious. "Hosting a little info session," he said smoothly. "Got a few city officials coming by. They were interested in how the greenhouse contributes to community power resilience." Karen squinted. "City officials? Ma'am should be here around noon." She stood frozen for a moment, visibly processing. "Well, they'll be very interested to hear that this structure is currently under review for noncompliance." "Oh, absolutely," he said, nodding. "They're bringing a few engineers too. Should be a lively discussion." He watched her retreat with visible confusion, clearly trying to figure out if this was some kind of bluff. Meanwhile, Miles continued prepping for the big moment. Inside the house, he set up his makeshift control center. The main dashboard showed live energy usage from the connected homes, current solar input, greenhouse efficiency stats, and most importantly, a simple toggling system he'd created for the occasion. The real masterpiece, though, was outside. Underneath the greenhouse, neatly covered by a set of removable panels, lay the neighborhood battery, his custom-built energy storage system. He arranged temporary transparent coverings, added a few signs explaining the design, and even printed out simplified diagrams for the less tech-savvy visitors. The goal wasn't to show off. It was to demonstrate how deeply and effectively the system had integrated with the neighborhood. At exactly noon, a hybrid SUV with a city seal pulled up. Out stepped 2 officials, a tech intern and the program director himself, who clapped Miles on the back like an old friend. Within minutes, they were touring the system, nodding with approval, asking questions, and taking photos. And right behind them, predictably, came Karen, dressed like she was prepared for battle or brunch with someone she hated. "What's going on here?" she demanded, stepping into the yard. The city rep turned. "Oh, you must be one of the neighbors benefiting from this setup. Incredible, isn't it? This greenhouse helps keep 5 homes powered during grid failures." Karen blinked. "What? I was told this structure was in violation of HOA codes." The director raised an eyebrow. "This project predates any HOA codes, and it was approved under the city's Green Initiative in 2019. Frankly, it's a model example. We're considering showcasing it at the next urban planning conference." Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Well, it's still unsightly." Miles smiled. "That's subjective, but would you like to see how much of your house's Christmas lighting was powered by this unsightly thing?" He led the group to the dashboard screen, where he pulled up the energy logs. Right there, in bright, friendly graphics, it showed real-time power distribution, including the day Karen's house spiked from her 14-piece reindeer display. The officials chuckled. Karen's face turned redder than a solar inverter overheating. And the real show, that was still coming. Miles waited until just the right moment. The crowd had grown, not just the city officials, but curious neighbors drawn by the sudden interest in his home. Some wandered around the greenhouse, impressed by the lush rows of strawberries and herbs. Others clustered near the battery system display, marveling at the quiet hum of the energy storage units. And Karen? She hovered nearby like a storm cloud, jaw clenched, eyes twitching every time someone complimented the setup she had tried to destroy. Then casually, Miles stepped forward with a small remote in his hand and cleared his throat. "Before we wrap up, I'd like to demonstrate something. It's a feature I added to the system a year ago, purely as a diagnostic tool, but pretty fun to show off. This button," he held up the remote like a magician presenting his final trick, "temporarily cuts power to all homes not connected to the greenhouse grid, then restores it after 5 seconds. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen narrowed her eyes. Miles continued. "Now don't worry, this doesn't affect the main grid. It just simulates what would happen during a blackout if the greenhouse wasn't here." He pressed the button. For 5 seconds, the neighborhood flickered into darkness. Houses went dark, porch lights died, and even Karen's decorative solar owl made a sad clicking sound as its backup cell failed. But the 5 homes connected to Miles' system. Their lights stayed on, warm, bright, and unaffected. Gasps and delighted laughter erupted from the crowd. Mr. Dalton, holding a soda, raised his can like a toast. "I knew it. I never lost power once." Karen's house, however, sat awkwardly dark. She scrambled to her porch, flicked the switch on her foyer lamp, and when nothing happened, turned around with a look of horror. Then everything turned back on. Just 5 seconds, but the point was made. The crowd now looked at the greenhouse not as some unsightly glass box, but as a lifeline. A quiet, green marvel that had been holding up the street all along. The city rep smiled broadly. "Miles, would you be willing to let us feature this on the municipal website? We'd love to make this a case study." Miles shrugged modestly. "If it helps others, sure." Karen, now looking like she'd swallowed a lemon whole, tried one last time. "This is still a residential neighborhood. There are rules." The city official turned to her. "Ma'am, this project is grandfathered in, fully permitted, and actively benefiting your community. If anything, more neighborhoods should have someone like Mr. Wren. Maybe instead of trying to shut it down, you could consider supporting it." And then he added with a grin, "Besides, we heard you've been benefiting from it already." The neighbors laughed. Karen did not. Instead, she spun on her heel, stormed off toward her house, and slammed the door so hard her plastic lavender shook in their pots. Miles looked around at the smiling faces, the thriving plants, the humming greenhouse, and couldn't help but smile too. Justice delivered electrically. Karen didn't come out of her house for 3 days. No porch surveillance, no passive-aggressive strolls with her clipboard, no HOA flyers slipped under doors at dawn. The neighborhood buzzed with theories. Some said she was reorganizing the HOA charter. Others joked she was writing a strongly worded email to the Department of Energy. But most just enjoyed the silence, a sweet, Karen-free peace that felt long overdue. Miles, meanwhile, went back to his usual rhythm. Morning coffee, greenhouse tending, and a little smirk every time he saw a new neighbor stop by to peek at the power dashboard he'd left visible through the front window. Even Mr. Johnston, the grumpy retired dentist from 2 doors down, had swung by to ask about hooking into the backup grid. The irony? Karen's smear campaign had accidentally turned Miles into the most popular man on the block. Then, like a villain in a midday soap, Karen reemerged. She marched onto Miles' lawn with a folder in hand, clearly trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. But instead of her usual smug confidence, her expression was tight, her cheeks still flushed with humiliation. "I've reviewed all the documentation," she said stiffly. "It appears your structure is technically compliant." "Technically, huh?" Miles replied, not even trying to hide his amusement. Karen ignored the jab. "However, I'll be proposing a new amendment to the HOA charter to prevent future unauthorized expansions." Miles tilted his head. "Let me know how that works out. I'll be here, powering your Wi-Fi." That jab hit home. Karen's nostrils flared. Across the street, Mrs. Nguyen was watching from her porch with popcorn in hand. Literally. A few other neighbors had gathered too, pretending to water plants or sweep already clean sidewalks, all eager for the next moment of Karen-induced chaos. Karen glanced around, realizing she no longer had an audience of loyal rule followers. No one was backing her. No one was even pretending to support her crusade anymore. Her power, like her Christmas lights, had flickered out. And Miles, he just gave her a polite nod and walked away. Later that evening, a new notice appeared on the community bulletin board. Handwritten, a little crooked, and notably not signed by Karen. "CRHQAB is hereby disbanded. All prior citations are null. Community potluck scheduled for next Saturday. Greenhouse salsa will be served." Karen had been dethroned. Her clipboard now a relic, her faux authority dismantled not by yelling or threats, but by facts, wires, tomatoes, and light. Humiliation didn't come in the form of public scolding. It came in a solar-powered showcase, and 5 seconds of darkness that exposed everything she tried to hide. And for the first time in a long while, Cedar Ridge felt like a neighborhood again. Spring settled into Cedar Ridge with a warm breeze and a sense of lighthearted normalcy. Gone were the constant passive-aggressive flyers and mysterious compliance checks. Instead, laughter floated across yards, neighbors waved more freely, and every few days someone new came by Miles' place asking about composting tips or how to install solar shingles. The greenhouse stood proudly above it all, a shining glass crown on Miles' modest brick home. Where once it was a target of suspicion and spite, it was now a symbol of resilience, innovation, and yes, sweet poetic revenge. At night, it glowed softly, casting a warm green shimmer over the street like a silent guardian of the grid. Karen, for her part, had become something of a recluse. Oh, she still strutted out now and then to tend to her fake lavender or try to trim hedges that didn't need trimming, but the clipboard never reappeared. Her attempts to push a new HOA charter died quietly in a neighborhood meeting where not a single person seconded her motion. Not even her previous yes-man, Larry, who'd since installed 2 solar panels and was proudly growing cherry tomatoes thanks to a tip from Miles. At the neighborhood potluck, hosted right in Miles' yard, greenhouse salsa front and center, Karen appeared late, holding a casserole no one touched. She sat quietly at the edge of the group, nodding occasionally but mostly listening. Maybe humbled, maybe just exhausted. Either way, the war was over. Mrs. Nguyen raised a plastic cup of homemade lemonade and gave a little toast. To greenhouses, good neighbors, and fewer flyers on our doors. Everyone laughed, even Karen, though hers was more of a chuckle that sounded like defeat seasoned with a hint of respect. Miles just smiled, raising his own glass. And to sunlight, may it always shine, especially when the grid goes down. The crowd cheered, and someone turned on music powered entirely by Miles' setup. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the greenhouse glowed once more, not just with LEDs and oxygen, but with something far more satisfying: vindication. From that point forward, any newcomers to Cedar Ridge were given a friendly tour. The park, the pond, and of course, Miles' greenhouse, spoken of with pride and just a dash of legend. And if anyone dared to ask about the clipboard lady, well, the neighbors would say with a smirk, let's just say she learned the hard way: never mess with the guy who controls your power. Peace restored, Karen humbled, tomatoes thriving. And Miles, he just kept growing, quietly, powerfully. Exactly the way he liked it.